Welcome to Leaping Larry's Revolutionary Reading Theatre.
Okay, welcome to the Reading Theater. Today we're continuing on with our read of George Jackson, Blood in My Eye. We're on chapter, I believe is 5. But either way, this is the longest chapter in it, and we will see if we do the whole thing in one sitting or not. Just depending on, I guess, timing. I'm not sure how long it's going to take. We gotta go to page 50, so we got like at least 20 some odd pages. Without further ado, classes at war, mobilization and contra-mobilization. Enough time has passed now since the emergence of fascism, the extreme crisis that precipitated it, and the hostilities that caused its early development, to view it with less of the coloring that sensationalism and war propaganda necessarily create. We should now be able, after some time has somewhat dulled the traumatic exchanges of debate and struggle, to analyze fascism objectively, its antecedents, its prime characteristics, and its goals. In denying its ideological importance, I am not suggesting that all of its advocates of the especially early period were opportunist or deranged individuals reacting to a personal threat to their own situation within the society. A great many of the early fascist intellectuals were responding to a very real social situation. As intelligentsia, keepers of a particular nation's system of values, art forms, and political thought, they felt it was their responsibility to attempt to resolve a growing social problem. My insistence upon the non-importance of ideology indeed rests squarely upon this point, that most of the fascist intellectuals were reacting to the uprootedness and social disintegration of the particular moment. And with each change in the face of this state of affairs, they were in large part forced to repudiate most of their former ideology. Weight is given to this observation by the fact that early fascism included an amalgam of expressionists, anarcho-syndicalists, futurists, Helgen idealists, theoretical syndicalists, nationalists, and, in the case of the Spanish Falange, intellectual anarchists. The whole theme of this early phase of fascism was not merely anti-communist, but fundamentally a general indictment of decadence, bourgeois decadence. Fascism also absorbed some socialists. In 1914, the Fasci de Aragon Revolucionaria formed itself out of a group of supranationalist patriots favoring Italian intervention in the war against the Central Powers. Benito Mussolini, a leader of the extreme syndicalist faction of the Socialist Party, supported them vehemently in his newspaper Il Popolo d'Italia, and of course this resulted in his expulsion from the party. In March 1919, after the deep disillusionment and unrest caused by the Italian participation in the war, Mussolini formed the first real fascio. The intellectuals that supported him did not do so out of a sense of the usual role of intellectual in society, i.e., to educate, to set the values of that society, in a time of extreme social disintegration and economic crisis. Men like Benedetto Croce and Arturo Toscanini and others like Giovanni Gentile and Gabriele d'Annunzio and Annunzio, one of Italy's greatest poets, supported Mussolini, almost out of desperation at what they felt to be a destructive national breakdown. All four were elitist and may have also felt that their status as intellectuals was also threatened. Recall the Russian Revolution had shocked the world to its foundations about this time. The general disregard of the Socialist Party for any art form or scientific activity that did not serve the state, and its tendency to factionalize and procrastinate alienated many of the nation's top intellectuals. But the final reason why the importance of ideology in fascism must be denied is the fact that it exists in more than one form. In fact, historically, it is proved to have three different faces. One, out of power, that tends to almost be revolutionary and subversive, anti-capitalist and anti-socialist. One, in power, but not secure. This is the sensational aspect of fascism that we see on screen and read of in pulp novels, when the ruling class, through its instrumental regime, is able to suppress the vanguard party of the people's and workers' movement. The third face of fascism exists when it is in power and securely so. During this phase, some dissent may even be allowed. In Italy, Trilucia, the poet, wrote and published more bitter and biting satires attacking the political regime than can be found in any of the so-called liberal democratic states. In April 1925, 3 years after the fascist march on Rome, Benito Croce was able to publish a clearly anti-fascist manifesto. The finished product, the actual fascist arraignment, is diametrically opposed to its original ideology. The regime turns openly traditionalist, and idiots like Mussolini receive the favor and compliments of other idiots like President Roosevelt, Bernard Shaw, DuPont, Kennedy, and H.G. Wells. This stems from an inevitable conflict between the notion of a new spiritualistic man and the theory of the ethical state. The ideals of obedience and creativity, authority and freedom, are so contradictory to each other, so mutually exclusive, that the ideology of fascism could never be taken seriously. The pseudo-intellectual origins of fascism can be traced all the way back to ancient Greece. The German National Socialist apologist Alfred Baumerl, expressionist Gottfried Benn both recognized Hegel, as did some of the Italian intellectuals and Eastern European fascists. The Western Europeans, however, favored the primitive, withdrawn ideals of Nietzsche, or confused combinations of Nietzsche and Hegel, with a bit of Plato's philosopher king added for window dressing. Spaceman J. Francis, welcome in, comrade. Get a shout out for Spaceman J. Francis if we have any mod available, please. Great to see you. Hope you're well. We're reading George Jackson's Blood in My Eye. Actually, there have been many different fascist ideals and arrangements, as there have been fascist societies. Which brings us to the relevant point of inquiry. The importance or form of a particular political regime can never be understood simply as it stands alone. Its social and economic past must be investigated and clearly defined before the distinctive being of the political realm takes shape. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that Germany and Italy reached nation-state status. Their heavy industrial sectors were rapidly expanding and coming into conflict with the traditionalist economic sectors. Though there were some clashes of interest within the extended family of the ruling classes at the point of their emergence into Western bourgeois culture, the section controlling the largest share of the GNP, in all cases, finally succeeded in gaining an even greater hold over the direction of the economy, with class interests generally working a compromise. The final result always involved a higher degree of centralization of power and control. I term this contrapositive mobilization. It occurs when the capitalist industrial sector of a particular society succeeds in altering the pre existing equilibrium in its favor. The period in question was characterized by the movement of masses from the traditional agricultural sector into the sweatshops, large and medium, of the cities. A policy was designed by the capitalist class to limit the range of choices of the newly mobilized masses. But the specter of communism was haunting Europe. The working masses began to organize and exert increasing influence in the realm of politics. This we will learn, this we will term positive mobilization. Just chilling in your new kitty room? Nice. That's awesome. One of them has 28 toes. Oh my god. We want a kitty. We want a kitty room. One day. One day we will. That's the fiance's dream, is the kitty room. Make sure you're all following Spaceman J. Francis, by the way. They may not be frequent streams, but they are fucking incredible streams. I'm happy to do the reading for you all, by the way. I love reading to y'all. So, a three-sided political struggle opened in the 20th century. Actually, it was a two-sided struggle. The proletariat against the ruling class. A multitude of conflicts existed within the ruling class, particularly between the older traditionalist sectors and the manufacturing class. Hey, Igloo, welcome in. Within these two factions, there were a number of separate interest groups. The corporative ideal had its roots in this conflict. Can't wait. Looking forward to it myself, Jay. Elitist conservative economics like Pareto theorized around such concepts as governing elites and general equilibrium. The object, of course, was to diffuse the positive mobilization of the working class. The system itself was ostensibly designed to balance the interests of all economic classes and substructural groups. However, in fact, its principal purpose was to check the growth of the vanguard party's influence on the working class. In its beginning, especially in Italy, it was too vague and difficult to control. General equilibrium was never reached, and class struggle went on unabated. Class consciousness sharpened, and the old bourgeois democratic states, torn from within and in conflict with each other, rushed towards their own ruin. There is another form of mobilization. There is another form of mass mobilization that has strong socio-economic significance. It lies between positive and contra-positive mobilization. It involves the men who were uprooted to serve the nation-state wars. Those who were recruited from the agricultural sector generally gravitated to the cities after their release, further dislocating the economy in favor of the modern sector. The traditional agricultural sector was forced to mechanize and pull marginal land out of production. In some areas, agriculture collapsed altogether. The result was the need to import foodstuffs and other agricultural products. This may or may not have damaged the overall economy, but in any case, it represented another function turned over to the modern sector. After World War I, International capitalism went through an expansion phase of the business cycle. At its base were the regenerative effects of war on capitalist production and speculation. But the boom was brief. The Great War had taken the whole business of destruction of surplus to the point of diminishing returns. The years 1920 to 25 were spent in recession and depression across the Western world. The few years that followed from 1925 to 1929, business roared back to recovery and expansion. Industrial manufacturing around the Western world and parts of the Third World, Japan, Argentina, Brazil, increased by 25%. The volume of world trade increased accordingly. However, an increase in the arts of agricultural production, under the strain to modernize without a corresponding increase in the ability of the great laboring masses to buy back what was being produced, precipitated a sharp fall in the price structure of foodstuffs in one of the world's largest agricultural sectors, the United States. It was underconsumption, not overproduction, and it led to the fatal stock market crash of 1929. The whole Western world went into recession and deep depression. Hey, Workers' Pulse, welcome in. Two countries were little affected by the general breakdown. Russia, which had taken itself off the wheel with a successful socialist revolution, and Italy, which had established a strong economic centralization that tended to close her economy off from the other bourgeois states. Italy had already established fascism shortly after World War I, during the 1920-25 economic crisis. That war had mobilized millions of Italians, most of whom were uprooted from over-traditionalist sectors of the proletariat. They had gone through the changes that most other Western countries were about to adopt. The key element that made the economic policy of fascist arrangement unique was the emphasis on reform through government intervention, the opposite of Adam Smith's invisible hand, working to coordinate economic activity, the opposite of the French revolutionary battle cry, laissez-faire. Big business was in a crisis, of course. After the short boom following World War I, the giant cartels and the national industrial and financial monopolies were starved to the bone in both periods of fascist arrangements. The early 20s of all the 30s, and all of the 30s. This gave the movements its seemingly middle-class antecedents, where large-scale manufacturing was not in complete control. Its straining to emerge as a dominant force within the economy was resisted by the petite bourgeois, the landed classes, and the medium proprietor. Here, we see fascism in its out-of-power stage. Stage 1. We hear its language sounding deceptively anti-capitalist. Parasitic capitalism, illegitimate capital, rapacious capital, etc., etc. This was true in Italy and with early fascism in Phalangist Spain and in Germany. Mussolini, who set up the first successful fascist regime, was a man trained all of his life in the revolutionary tactics and strategy of scientific socialism. His departure from the international socialist movement dated from the moment he gave his unreasonable support to a nation-state war in which the working class of one or more nations was manipulated into the murder of the working class of other nations by the ruling classes of the respective states. His opposition to the Socialist Party and his participation in reformist capitalism were no doubt due to the factionalism and basically reformist attitude of the Socialist Party. in spite of the fact that the Socialists won 156 seats in the chamber in the elections of 1919, over 50% more than the next largest political party, the Catholic Popular Party, and won majorities in the councils of 2,202 communes and 26 provinces. There were 8,507 communes and 69 provinces. In the general administration elections of the following year, and in spite of the fact that the Socialist General Confederation of Labor had grown from 300,000 members before World War I to almost 2.5 million members in 1920, the Socialists seemed powerless to solve the nation's economic problems with the promised revolution. In 1920, the Socialist Party seized control of all the nation's steel manufacturing plants, but incredibly returned them to the private interests. Several accounts claim that the workers couldn't run the plants, but if the makers of the steel can't make steel, obviously it was a problem of the direction and management of the Vanguard Party. There were strikes, slowdowns, lockouts, and the kinds of disorders that precede revolution or counter-revolution. In the years following the war and during the early depression of 1920-25, Italy could have gone either socialist or fascist. There were partisans enough in both parties to lead the uprooted, disintegrating society into a new direction. The difference was in the nature of the leadership, along with the question of who would be willing to commit their whole fortunes and futures to the battle. Mussolini took his black shirt army and moved to the fight, killing and suppressing his opposition for the interests of an alarmed industrial traditionalist elite. He was well educated in the science of positive mobilization, which made him a natural architect of the contra-positive mobilization intended to diffuse the working class movement. He seized power in 1922 with the full support of the northern industrialists, the petit bourgeois, and the older traditionalist agrarian interests. The 1921 elections left his party with only 35 seats out of a possible 535 in the parliamentary body. But by applying violence judiciously and scientifically, as he had learned from Lenin, he was able to force the abdication of the king and the constitutional monarchy and form the first political regime representing the new direction of capitalist development. Eyes right, he pumped bullets into the old left and new life into capitalism. The people were to exist solely for the state, read the ruling class. This was the very antithesis of socialism. This period marked the second phase of fascism, the Dark Night, when it was still insecure. But it went on to develop a closed economy, quote unquote, with directed investment in public works projects. It proceeded to fill the economic vacuum with surplus capital and supranationalism. Believe, fight, obey. State-protected industries, mainly in munitions and shipbuilding. Italy extended her power facilities and opened new marginal agricultural land for its new slaves, new educational facilities, and new educators. Out of 1,250 university professors, only 12 refused to take the academic's oath of loyalty to the regime in 1931. Were also part of the reforms. Taken all together, the reforms turned out to be extreme reaction. The government of 1870 had seized the Papal States. The regime brought back the old religion. In 1929, In spite of the unrewarding experiences of World War I, the regime was allowed to make war again in Africa, in Europe. This marked the third phase of fascism, in power and secure. The point here is that fascism emerged out of weakness in the pre existing economic arrangement and in the old left. And the weakness must be assigned to the vanguard party, not the people. The People's Party failed to direct the masses properly, with positive suppression of their class enemies and their goons. Mussolini was able to proclaim that fascism held the only solution to the people's problem by default. Fascism, the new arrangement, the rearrangement, the strengthening and reforming of laissez faire competitive capitalism, was anti socialist from its inception. It attempted to conceal the reality of class struggle by disguising itself as a new solution to national problems, by defying the interests of the whole state, which turned out to be the interests only of the state's ruling classes. Fascism is always a response to a threat to the establishment. Any anti-establishment actions taken by the strictly political arm of a forming fascist arrangement are simply attempts to centralize or upstage the capitalist industrial sector, either to establish it, as in Spain, or to modernize it, as in those cases where marginal productive interests are absorbed or destroyed by the arrangement. It is significant to note that no fascist regime in power has advocated that abolition of any form of private ownership. The fascist regime and private ownership work hand in hand. No modern political regime can exist for long without the cooperation of those who control the means of production. The shock troops of fascism, on the mass political level, are drawn from members of the lower middle class, who feel the upward thrust of the lower classes more acutely. These classes feel that any dislocation of the present economy resulting from the upward thrust of the masses would affect their status first. Now, when I'm reading this part, what I want you to think about is the way that Midwestern Marx is constantly talking about the middle class in their analyses. Just have that in mind, please. They are joined by that sector of the working class which is backward enough to be affected by the nationalistic trappings and the loyalty syndrome that the sociologists have termed the authoritarian personality. One primary aim of the fascist arrangement is to extend and develop this new pig class to degenerate and diffuse working class consciousness, with a psychosocial appeal to man's herd instincts. Yes, they do, and they write about it all the time, Robo, in the most cringe ways imaginable. Development and exploitation of the authoritarian syndrome is at the center of totalitarian capitalism, fascism. It feeds on a small, but still false sense of class consciousness and the need for community. The collective spirit in fascism is a morbid phenomenon that grows out of the psychopathology of mob behavior, with each development in the fascist arrangement, the marriage between the political elite and economic elite becomes more apparent. The integration of the various sectors of the total economic elites becomes more pronounced. The Roumerian Iron Guard was no exception. It would have eventually bedded down with the owners and financiers and integrated the anarchic sectors of the traditionalist capitalist elites. With the modern sectors, had it not encountered the Red Army. The generals and colonels of the various Latin American fascist regimes are attempting contrapositive mobilization and functioning as an instrument to balance the interests of the traditionalist with the more modern sectors of the neo-colonial nations. It is very misleading to regard them as the ruling class of such nations, or to consider them as part of the populistic movement, as in Romania and Spain. State intervention simply serves the best interests of a diminishing capitalist ruling class by restructuring it and destroying the people's labor movement. Capitalist political regimes cannot exist on their own. Without the support of government, capitalism simply cannot prevail. Peron was a fascist. The peace he worked out between labor and owner was subtle and disguised, but nonetheless fascist, in that it appeased and diffused the workers' resentment of the non-worker and effected a quite efficient counter-positive mobilization. Peron maintained an apparent popular appeal through his years as head of the state because of the vanguard party's willingness to settle for reformism and tokens in a less than junior partner relationship with capital. His arrangement of the fascist state was indeed singular. Like the USA, the original structure of the society.
Feel that? Feel what, Mr. Lee? The way the shit clings to the air, Randy? Shit clings to the air? It's already started, my dear good friend. What started, Mr. Lee?
The shit blizzard.
The shit blizzard.
Thank you, comrades. I knew I felt something. Appreciate those biddies, comrade. Thank you, thank you. That was 90% shadidity in the air. Definitely. I feel that 90% shadidity. It could rain. The shit rain could start at any moment. Like the USA, the original structure of the society in which
I've got some literature in my car that will change your whole way of thinking.
Oh shit, the shittening! Robo, thank you. Thank you, comrade. Appreciate your support. I appreciate you supporting this the shit winds that we're moving in. The shit pressure from the shit front. I feel a shit front moving in. If we get one more gifty from a third source, one more gift or over 100 biddy thing from a third source, we get to hear the Juche Gang theme song. Just something to keep in mind to yourselves. Like the USA, the original structure of the society in which he had to work, his scientific manipulations, had only one available sector large enough and uprooted enough.
Get in there. Two spawns cars full of weed just like this, okay?
Okay.
Jacob, you're in control. Don't fuck up.
Okay, boys, this is it. Let's fucking move it.
Boys, I got the Swayze Express.
Good. Load it in the car. We're gonna hook up with Sparson in 6 hours.
The whole world's searching for that train, you idiots. You won't even make it to Shitville.
Long live the People's Revolution!
Yeah, I repeat myself a lot. And then Doom. Maybe Doom. Alright, let's go. Let's finish this shit. We got this. George Jackson. Blood in My Eye continues. He was fondly disposed when he lost the favor of the economic elites. Talking about Peron here. Peron the fascist found his strongest support in labor. He was fondly deposed when he lost the favor of the economic elites. At the heart of all fascist manipulators are elitist and revere private ownership. They are backward and reactionary to the ultimate extreme of self-destruction. Peron might have held on to his position had he chosen to serve the laboring class honestly and to make a genuine power base for society. one which truly embraced their interests by nationalizing the productive facilities and turning them over to labor's management. But fascists would rather die or flee than support total revolution. So they must be slain. The very first step in establishing the whole interest of the state, the combine, the corporate state, is to dismantle the working class movement and replace it either with a state-controlled organ or no organization at all. The corporate law passed in Italy in 1934 served only to sanction the complete destruction of the proletarian movement. At the same time, they set up an automatic defense mechanism against future labor activity. In disputes, labor was represented by men sworn either to the state or without the skill and intelligence to effect labor's demands. The manufacturing class had long since literally married into the regime. In Italy, the fascist party cadre spread throughout the nation, organizing people left aimless by the failure of the positive mobilization of the socialist vanguard parties. People who had dropped out defected. People who became uprooted and unemployed either by the war or the deflated economy. This organizing must be considered contrapositive mobilization, in that its intent was to conflate the capitalist economy and deflate the workers' and people's influence and control over the economy. With easy credit, inflationary financing, and increased government sponsorship of public work projects, fascism in Italy, Germany, and Japan succeeded in reconstructing capitalist productive institutions and traditional property relations. After the takeover, Italy recovered rapidly from the 1920-25 post-war depression. The ordinary complexities created by inflationary budgeting did not immediately manifest themselves because of the pre-existing state of the economy. The untapped productive factors, capital and labor, were grinding to a standstill. Cost of living and cost of production under those circumstances did not immediately rise to the point of crisis, diminishing returns for capital, decreasing in real wages of labor. Later, in both Italy, 1925-26, and Germany, 1937-38, this inflationary budgeting showed damaging trends and set off a chain reaction in Germany that may have eventually led to its downfall. However, the heart of the fascist economy is an attempt at control through centralization, monopoly capital control, price fixing, wage freezes, and carefully balanced foreign trade. AES stands for Actually Existing Socialism. I heard a communist say that how when it comes to First Nations they have zero criticisms, but when referring to actually existing nations they have critical support. What's the difference between the struggles of the First Nations and the struggle of actually existing nations? Why would we differentiate the two? That's the thing, and that's the problem. I think that speaks to a certain thing and why I mistrust certain anti-authoritarian support, because it's like, well, you support us so long as we haven't achieved it, right? But from what I've seen is anytime someone has actually achieved their liberation and built up the necessary means of fighting off counter-revolution, that's when a lot of these milquetoast allies will then turn on you and say, oh no, that's actually too authoritarian now to support, right? DPRK is a perfect example. That is the indigenous Korean government, because they're not just the indigenous Korean government, they're also a socialist government that has put the means of production in the hands of the people, right? On top of that. But, for certain leftists here in the West, that's not enough, right? And they think that therefore any mistake or any crime or anything that happens there is proof that it's a capitalist society and not actually a revolutionary society, right? Erroneously. Because, as I constantly say, like, it is an inter-revolutionary society. Mistakes are going to happen. People ask me about, like, DPRK kidnapping Japanese people in the past. And, you know, DPRK literally admitted that that was a mistake, and they apologized for that. And explained the reasons why this happened, right? So like at the end of the day, we recognize that any country can make mistakes. But the point is, and I reiterate all the time, the point is, my criteria is what happened to the people who couldn't eat before? What happened to the people who were getting bombed before? Right? Did it stop that? Yes. Then I essentially support it. And DPRK has gone even further than just that, you know? It's building up what I think is like a model for lots of other socialist countries. It talks about that being the case all the time. That it's much the same strategy as what USSR itself had, which was to build up the best possible example of a socialist society that they can, and then that serves as an example to the rest of the world of how to do so themselves. And that is the main way in which a socialist country contributes externally to world revolution, aside from, you know, giving like active material support and stuff like this. Yeah, well, I mean, Korea is again, it's their native nation, so yeah. Again, that's Sam. When someone says that to me, it makes me think that if my nation or if nations here in the West were to have success in revolution, and we were actually strong enough to fight against counter revolution, we would lose a whole bunch of support from these fucking white settler leftists. Let's be real, right? Yeah, right now the only thing the DPRK is suffering from is being propagandized because it's an enormous threat to the ruling class. Exactly. Hey, Radisby, welcome in. We're just reading George Jackson's Blood in My Eye here. Yeah, I'm tired of everybody like emphasizing this fucking critical support. Like nobody even like Jesus Christ. I'm sick of it. I'm sick of it because to so many people, critical support just means support by just parroting imperialist propaganda. I think we have one chapter left after this for Disby, but this is a big chapter. So. Yeah. How about you support? How about you just support it and not worry so much about what the fuck this critical bullshit constantly is? Like, I swear, because everybody they just when they say critical support, they literally like they're talking about just legitimate your support by like appealing to some mainstream notion or another. It just seems it's like at this point it's like a meaningless term to me. All right, let's continue. The first currency crisis, stimulated by Italy's inflationary policies, initiated in 1925, resulted in the stabilizing of the lira by decree in 1927. A controlled deflationary period followed, effected through the banking system, which the regime influenced by decree or advice. Private interests protected themselves from totally destructive competition by using the regime as a referee. After the Great Depression and the international rise of fascist states by default, refinements in its simple currency control methods were introduced. The replacement of competition with cooperation among the private interests became more standardized. And Comrade Ski, right there, what you just say, everyone has work to do. Nobody is perfect is exactly why I think it's such like a useless thing to do. If you really have to shore up your response, just like you can just do like sort of like what I do, right? Like just point out to people that nowhere is perfect. Like no human organization is perfect, especially in a world where you got to fight against imperialism and colonialism. So recognizing that DPRK, Cuba, USSR, China, whatever, recognizing these places aren't and weren't perfect does not, that's it. I recognize they're not perfect. I still support them. The end. That's the way I like to respond to that myself. The Germans realized that inflationary currency control would have little effect on the expansion of heavy industry, without also controlling the capital market. Direction of investment was also a key factor in the arrangement. Again, the regime functioned as a centralizing, mitigating influence. Real wages began to fall and national production rose. Considered again, the gross national product investment rose 25% by 1937 in Germany. The same 25% figure held true for Japan in the middle and late 30s. From 15% of GNP at the lowest point of the Great Depression in fascist Italy, annual average investment in industry rose to 19 or 20% in the years 1936 to 40. Because Italian fascism was already established when the entire Western capital markets banking system failed, there was a sizable amount of quasi-government ownership. The Industrial Reconstruction Institute, established by the regime, was quite simply a financial institution, a huge bank. It was indirectly owned or influenced large sectors of the nation's heavy industry. A further hint at an upward thrust of the middle classes to fill in sections of the traditional ruling class destroyed by the forces of the business cycle. In general, the developments and experiments in controlled capitalism resulted in a concentration of economic power in the large monopolies. The crisis in German foreign exchange murdered the small businessmen. Small agricultural units tended to disappear because of low wages, low consumption, and large increases in the arts of agricultural production. The necessity for government intervention increased as the interest of the private elites generated new tensions. The breakdown of the big industrial pattern into sections, the regulation or elimination of real competition, except, of course, for labor, when it was short, and the control of labor organizations basically comprised the whole of the new fascist economic
It's
arrangement.
all for one motherfucker and one motherfucker for all motherfuckers everywhere, you know what I'm saying?
Thank you, comrade. Thank you so much for the gift sub 220 for Twitch, appreciate you. Which attempted to reduce the vast strata of classes and class interests of the pre-existing state of the economy to just the two principal classes, the haves and the have-nots. The psychosocial dimensions of fascism become quite complex, but they can be simplified by thinking of them as part of a collective bargaining process carried on between all the elites of the particular state, with the regime acting as the arbiter. The regime's interests are subject to those of the ruling class. Labor is a partner in this arrangement. At the head of any labor organization is the fascist state. There is an elite which is tied to the interests of the regime, and consequently tied also to the economic status quo. Best emotes on Twitch right here. One reason to subscribe, I tell you. The trappings of this pseudo mass society are empty, cheap, spectacular leisure sports, parades where strangers meet, shout each other down, and often trample each other to death on the way home. Mass consumption of worthless super suds or aspirin, ritualistic ultra-nationalistic events on days to glorify the idiots who died at war, or other days to deify those who sent them out to die. A mass society that is actually a mass jungle. At its core, fascism is capitalistic, and capitalism is international. Beneath its nationalist ideological trappings, fascism is always ultimately an international movement. And I talked about that before, right? I think if you go back, you'll see, and we will read it one day, where I talk about how in Kim Jong-il's work on having a correct understanding of nationalism, he points out actually that the bourgeois nationalism, fascism, all of this fake quasi-nationalism is just that. Fake quasi-nationalism. They don't have, there is no real like bourgeois nationalism, so to speak. It's all just a cloak for their interests, which is capital, the interests of capital, right? Which ultimately are international, as we know. They want to extend. Yeah. Primary mode of dollarization is to create a zone for oligarchs to do business from. Exactly. They have no actual allegiance to any nation or anything like this. That's just all a cloak, and people fall for that cloak. That's what it is. So the idea of there being a bourgeois nationalism versus a proletarian nationalism is almost erroneous, right? It's that nationalism is something that was created by the masses, and certain rhetoric and the hollowness of nationalism is used by the imperialist for their own ends, for their own means, much like a lot of other things are, like religion, right? To take another example of something that is sort of a similar way. Many of the fascist regimes that failed or lacked thrust, the Belgian Rexists, the Dutch NSB, National Socialist Movement, Japan's arrangement, Romania's Iron Guard, were all essentially too imitative and inflexible. That's Jeff Bezos. Doesn't want you to get this dank information, Jay. Fuck you, Bezos! And then immediately banned. Even the totalitarians must be supple and responsive if they are to survive. Peronism was imitative, as was the Brazilian Integratis. They were emulating their colonial masters in the USA. Look at that. Look at the animation I got for that soundbite. Isn't that great? They were emulating their colonial masters in the USA. So one fascist regime falls to another, more efficient fascist regime. Two factors must be seriously considered when analyzing the two largest fascist states in Latin America: Brazil and Argentina. Their dependence on foreign trade and their neo-colonial status, which involves dependence on foreign investment. When exports fail, as they did during the Depression of the 30s, the value of the national currency must also fall, and it follows that imports automatically decrease. The battle to balance payments between necessitating massive governmental intervention, which leads inexorably to inflationary domestic economic policy, and sometimes to a conflict of interest within the ruling class of the parent nation. Concern for balance of payments determines internal economic motives. The deficit financing, the attempt to control incomes by controlling labor, price fixing, government stockpiling of agricultural surpluses, positive direction of investments, and the balancing of the interests of the dualistic economy's elites can all be pointed to as evidence of an attempt to employ the centralist controls that characterize the classic fascist arrangement. Exactly, Komretsky. The first fascist regime of Brazil was headed by Vargas. It lasted from 1930 to 45. Coffee exports formed 70% of the nation's GNP prior to Vargas' takeover and depression. When international trade, especially in agricultural goods, collapsed, Vargas was forced to attempt experiments with the so-called closed economy. New internal markets had to be created, investment and motives relocated, industrialization attempted. But all of this planning, though successful to an extent, was still basically imitative and did not accurately reflect the realities of the nation's inability to accumulate capital. It is extremely important not to confuse the three phases of fascism when studying Latin America. The second phase is power, but not secure, is the really significant part of the whole fascist episode. Regime after regime has failed to increase internal demand or unseat the traditionalist landed elite in favor of small industrial interests. This means a permanent dependence on foreign trade and investment for machine tools, for weapons, to control the people's movements, and for raw materials to feed their light industries and flea markets. Consequently, we see these areas in the most glaring dichotomy of social economic injustice. In the shadow of their plush beach resorts, which attract degenerates from all over the Western world, literally within rifle shot, live the people who service these vacation resort complexes, in disease-infested, corrugated tin shanties on hillsides, constantly ravaged by mudslides. A strange combination of the first two phases of fascism. Without the massive military aid of the United States, Gestapo death squads, and the most intensive rightist terror, the guns of liberation would by now have certainly filled the streets and forests with blood to the horse's brow. It is important never to lose sight of Latin America's neo-colonial status. A victory for the People's Liberation Armies entails a victory over international capitalism, and especially a victory over their colonial masters. The puppet regimes of these areas cannot move firmly into phase 3 of the fascist arrangement for two reasons. The people are willing to use arms and are learning to use them more effectively, and because the regimes are imitative and not indigenous. They do not reflect the real interests of the nation's elites, but rather the interests of the ruling elites of the parent imperial nation, the USA. Germany attempted to rearm, deflate its currency, and at the same time continued to meet the war-swollen demands of heavy industry. It finally fell of its own weight. The fascist economic arrangement failed under the pressure of war in Germany, in Austria, in Italy, and Japan, as later it failed the first regimes in Brazil and Argentina. The principal failing was very much the same that brought down laissez-faire. The capitalist business cycle cannot be controlled. Inflationary spasmodic attacks, regional recession, and depression pursue capitalism in all its forms like a nemesis, break its spirit, reduce its top-heavy bureaucratic backbone to jelly. Inflation, at first the key to regeneration, after an extended collapse, ultimately leads to complex problems that seem to be beyond regulatory remedy. To control it by compressing wage demands always turns out to be politically unsound. Hey Bob, welcome in, comrade. We're reading the biggest chapter from Blood in My Eye right now. Class consciousness in Germany was better developed than in any other European nation before and after the fascist takeover. So, consciousness alone is obviously not the factor that determines which way a disintegrating society would develop, fascist or socialist. The task of diffusing the people's labor movement and balancing it in favor of a few special individual heavy industrial firms and the vital interests of the increasingly important chemical industry fell to the regime-sponsored Labor Front. Its first attempt to appease labor came in the form of slightly improved working conditions, meaningless slogans like "strength through joy," which echoed the Anglo-American work ethic. Even after the forcible suppression of the Vanguard Party by the Gestapo in the first years of the regime, the potential political power of labor, due to the workers' importance in the production of heavy armaments, was such that really effective measures for controlling it were not devised throughout the tenure of the Third Reich. Wage increases couldn't be avoided. Rigorous state controls replaced mild repression and propaganda only after the Sunderland affair of 1938 and the accentuated armaments drive of 1939. Because wages could not be successfully held down, the individual firms were after profits. Bear in mind, consequently, that they devised many indirect incentives designed to attract a shrinking labor market. Measures were taken to the limit. The movement of laborers from place to place, and other factors of production were openly channeled into the armament sectors by stringent government intervention. All ideological pretenses were dropped. Racism and the interests of military-industrial complex formed the economic and psychosocial motives of the society that shook it apart. IG Farben, that was mentioned there, profited from the Holocaust, also produced Zyklon B. It was only actually liquidated in 2012. Thanks for that, cursed tidbit, March. Appreciate the background info always. The German economy, and it was mentioned when the chemical industry was mentioned up here. The German economy was already in ruins by the time the Reich expanded into Russia. This expansion itself was a symptom of the economy's death-directed lack of discipline, and its own internal contradictions and deceits destroyed it. An industrial military-based economy must expand to live, must forcibly balance trade in its favor to survive. No amount of logic or defense can influence the men who have vested interests in the life of such an arrangement. Only organized violence and armed struggle could have stopped them before they lost their minds and destroyed so many lives. The counter-terrorism of the Socialist Party's vanguard and the proper direction of the people's consciousness could have been changed the whole course of society over the last 50 years. Once fascism moves into its third phase and contra-positive mobilization, the psychosocial antithesis of lower-class mobilization, insinuates itself technologically with weapons and control of the means of the people's subsistence, limiting their vision to their own personal short-term interests with propaganda and empty promises. Only he who does not fear death of 1,000 cuts can then unseat the Führer. The United States was not existing in a vacuum when fascism first swept the Western world on the heels of two Great Depressions. My reading of history indicates that the US was in greater economic, social, and political crisis after the 1929 stock market crash than any other Western country, excepting possibly Germany. The same trends, the same experiments, the same internal battles were fought by the same forces for the direction of the nation's economy. The extreme economic crisis of the early 30s brought working class revolutionary consciousness to its very peak. All serious commentary on this period reflects a profound lack of confidence in the workability of capitalism. This avalanche of criticism came from sectors of the middle and right-oriented thinkers as well as the left, just as it did in Germany, Italy, Romania, and the other fascist storm centers. But of course, the middle and rightist intellectuals were thinking in terms of a new direction for capitalist growth, not in the abolishment, a New Deal, much like those of Nazi, fascist, and phalangist Europe. No serious or honest student could miss the likeness. FDR was a fascist. His stated, documented, congratulatory messages to Mussolini were not simply diplomatic gestures. Joseph Kennedy's advice to England to surrender to German expansion did not necessarily originate in Kennedy's mind. He was official ambassador of the US to England. There was positive mobilization of workers and the lower class, and a highly developed class consciousness. There was indeed a very deep economic crisis, with attendant strikes, unionizing, lockouts, break-ins, call-outs of the National Guard. The lower class was threatening to unite under the pressure of economic disintegration. Revolution was in the air. Socialist vanguard parties were leading it. There was terrorism from the right, from groups such as the Guardians of the Republic, the Black Legion, Pegleg, White Storm type troopers, and hired assassins who carried out the beginnings of contrapositive suppressive mobilization. Under the threat of revolution, the ruling class, true to Marxian theory, became all the more cooperative and dangerous. FDR was born and bred in this ruling class of families. His role was to form the first fascist regime, to merge the economic, political, and labor elites. Governing elites, corporative state, fascism, his role was to limit competition, replace it with the dream of cooperation, to put laissez-faire to rest, and initiate the acceptance of government intervention into economic affairs. Not quite the way that Midwestern Marx talks about FDR, is it? Curiously enough. But I digress. A great many of the early trends of American history prepared the way for the ultimate success of fascism in its highest form. From the very beginning of America's existence as an independent nation state, there were localized labor organizations that attempted to further the interests of their class by influencing the social, political, and economic life of the new nation. It wasn't until the second half of the 19th century that labor took on a national character and began to
I've got some literature in my car that will change your whole way of thinking.
Hey, Spaceman J. Francis, thank you for the resub. Thank you, comrade, thank you. Appreciate you so much. Your streams are fire. I can't wait to see you back. But take care of yourself first. Take your time. And just saying, damn, that setup of yours. Thanks for your support, comrade. Appreciate you. It wasn't until the second half of the 19th century that labor took on a national character and began to make its presence felt in the economic life of the nation. Even then, it was resisted by the violence of employers and government working together. Marx's definition of history as a broken, twisted, sordid spectrum of class struggles is substantiated by American labor history. The earliest significant struggles between labor and capital began in the 1790s on the East Coast in cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, where mutual aid craft societies attempted to gain higher wages and shorter working hours. Resistance from employers and their backers in government to these mild organizational efforts forced the establishment of the first trade unions, the Philadelphia Printers Union, the New York Typographical Union of 1794, Journeyman Cabinet and Chairmakers of 1796. The first wage strike was organized by the Society of Journeyman Cordwainers, Shoemakers of Philadelphia. It lasted 10 or 11 weeks in 1799 and was broken by right-wing terrorist activity. The laying to rest of laissez-faire, the shackling of Adam Smith's invisible hand, really began during the Civil War in the U.S. The petit bourgeois dream of countless contending private proprietorships, somehow managing a mellifluous blending of private and state interests, when long-range plans could still be made by wage workers to be proprietors one day, became a nightmare with the advent of the mass manufacturing process. At the opening of the Civil War, the U.S. was ranked fourth among the world's industrial states, behind the English Empire, the German states, and France. By 1870, the U.S. industrial manufacturing plant had doubled the value of its products. The number of factory workers drawn out of other sectors of the economy caused the industrial workforce to nearly double during the same period. Improvements in the arts of agricultural production drew some workers from the countryside and sent others westward towards the closing frontier. The craftsman lost his privileged economic position with the appearance of newly invented mass production machinery. This new machinery, and the factory setup in general, made individual workers more expendable and made it possible to reduce their share of the profits. By the mid-1890s, the U.S. was producing 1/3 of the world's manufactured goods, and was on its way to becoming first among the world's industrial states. And all of this, by the way, is why I don't know how many of you caught Ben Norton recently did a video where he talks about how we're moving towards neo-feudalism, or he says we're building neo-feudalism. Dave Legend was actually watching it on his stream this morning, so I happened to catch a little bit of it. And I just found this book explains what's going on, I think, so much more clearly. It's not that it's not building neo-feudalism or something. That's just how fascism develops, right? And as this book points out, fascism has been in its advanced form in the United States for a very long time. For such a long time that it allows dissent, seemingly, right? That is comfortable with that dissent. The expansion of U.S. industry out of the demands of the Civil War involved a complex concentration of several violent and predictable capital mandates. The old traditional sector of the landed aristocracy was broken. Machine tools, transport, and communications boomed. The basis of the industrial state, and, of course, an industrial elite, when raw materials, coal, iron, and other ores are not lacking. The price or value of labor shrank, and the drive towards monopoly accumulation was firmly established. This period of capital accumulation, invention of new machinery, its use in expanding factory setups, the closed economy created by Republican government legislation, and the direction of certain amounts of capital through government contracts were part of the beginnings of a new chapter in the authoritarian process of Western history. Industrial centralization, the refined tactics of monopolized capitalism, may have been developed right here in the United States. This is the logical place to question some of the old left's historical assumptions about the last 100 years of life. Analysts of the old left are completely confused by the differences between bourgeois democracy and monopoly capital and their manifestations on the American scene. They seem to feel that both can coexist in the same society. Actually, one simply grows out of the other. Monopoly capital is the central objective of corporative fascism. Prior to the Civil War and the emergence of the trends towards monopoly capital, America was dominated by bourgeois democratic economies and political rule. The economy was based upon the diverse ownership of many thousands factory units and a political arrangement to reflect that fact. However, with the emergence and expansion of monopoly capital after the economic impetus of the Civil War, bourgeois democracy naturally began to fade. Bourgeois democracy, the political rule of the bourgeoisie, simply cannot exist after the emergence of monopoly capital. Monopoly capital has its own political expression. It develops as bourgeois democratic political rule declines. The roots of corporativism fascism were laid with the expansion of monopoly capital into the giant cartels, corporations, and interlocking trusts. The owners of the largest share of the nation's GNP will always control the political life of the government of the state. Monopoly capital is corporativism, fascism. I don't think anything that ever happened in Italy, Spain, Germany, or any of the other capitalist states can match the centralizing process that the US went through in the last 100 years. Even the so-called public utilities, AT&T, the Santa Fe, Pennsylvania Railroad, Western Electric, Western Union, are owned by financial institutions that, on examination, always turn out to be controlled by a few families who were descendants of the industrial expansion of 1865-95. The traditional Anglo-Saxon concept of law, founded on the latent principles that the haves must always be protected from the have-nots, though it did not attack labor as openly as in England, effectively prohibited the emergence of any really strong labor movement until the close of the 19th century. It did not prevent the war profiteering, Rockefeller Petroleum Combination from forming. It didn't stop Western Union from taking over the telegraph industry. It didn't stop Samuel Slater and the Boston Associates from tying up all New England textile interests. The Transcontinental Railway hookup, May 19, 1965, Union Pacific and Central Pacific, could have never been accomplished without government and commercial cooperation. Cooperation and lawlessness were the basis of their commercial success, but no one was charged or punished by law. Any individual, on the other hand, who joined with someone else to effect an increase in his wage was guilty of conspiracy. That same law is still used to protect the same interests today. Anglo-Saxon law supported F.B. Gowen of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad and its coal subsidiary in cutting wages and breaking unions, just as it supported the KKK in reconstructing southeastern U.S. King of Baltimore and Ohio, Tom Scott of Pennsylvania, William Vanderbilt of New York Central. Every time I hear the word law, I visualize gangs of militiamen or Pinkertons busting strikes, pigs wearing sheets and caps that fit over their pointed heads. I see a white oak and a barefooted black hanging, or snake eyes peeping down the lenses of telescope rifles, or conspiracy trials. One. This is from W. Reich, The Mass Psychology of Fascism. So this is aspects of the mass psychology of fascism here. 1. Mankind is biologically sick. 2. Politics is an irrational expression of this sickness. Whatever takes place in social life is actively or passively, voluntarily or involuntarily determined by the structure of the masses of the people. The character structure is formed by socio-economic processes, and it anchors and perpetuates these processes. Man's biopathic character structure is, as it were, the fossilization of the authoritarian process of history. It is the biophysical reproduction of mass suppression. The human structure is animated by the contradiction between the intense longing for and fear of freedom. The fear of freedom of masses of people is expressed in the biophysical rigidity of the organism and the inflexibility of the character. Every form of social leadership is merely the social expression of one or the other side of the structure of the masses of the people. W. Reich, The Mass Psychology of Fascism. Revolutionary change always involves the complete alteration of the structure of property relations and the institutional substructures that support them. It leads from hierarchy to mass society. And this is why I, of course, completely reject a certain notion that we see from these PATSOCs that the U.S. has had 3 revolutions. This statement right here is so important. Revolutionary change always involves the complete alteration of the structure of property relations and the institutional substructures that support them. That part is so important. The ruling class in the U.S. is composed of 1 million men and their families. The Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, Morgans, Mellons, DuPonts, Hunts, Gettys, Fords, and their minions and dependents. They use the Ivy League universities and elite law schools as private schools for their offsprings and as training grounds for their corporate hirelings. They rule with iron precision through the militancy, through the military, the CIA, the FBI, expressions of their militancy, private foundations, and financial institutions. Their control of all the media, of education and communication comprises an extremely effective system of thought control. At the time when the ruling class was forming 100 years ago, the International Workingmen's Party supported strikes that asked only for reformist measures, although it was aware, even at that time, that reform was not the solution, and it quietly advocated the seizure of the materials of production. The dichotomy between the longing for true freedom and the fear of its responsibility was apparent even then. Early radicals excused themselves by claiming that they were exploiting the inherent contradictions of monopoly capital. They hoped that their masses would spontaneously awaken to the fact that capitalism had grown decadent. But capitalism reformed itself, apologized to no one, and went on to build a network of national and international centralization that stands unrivaled by any hierarchy, past or present. Reformism is an old story in America. There have been depressions and socio-economic political crisis throughout the period that marked the formation of the present upper class ruling circle and their controlling elites. But the parties of the left were too committed to reformism to exploit the revolutionary potential. You might already see, right, that what he's getting at here, or a big reason for the blame, is to be put on the leadership, the vanguard, right? Improper leadership. And this is one reason why I constantly stress to you, like, read Che Guevara's Socialism and Man in Cuba. Read Kim Jong-il, read DPRK on the leadership theories and stuff. And understand that that leaders and the proper dialectical understanding of the relationship between leaders and the masses is absolutely vital for success of revolution. In other words, I hate to say it, I hate to tell you this, but unfortunately, you need leadership in revolution. We recognize that it's not Kim Il-sung or Kim Jong-il or Mao or Stalin making all of these decisions individually, but they do represent the whole leadership of the party. And the failure to properly understand that will only have us making a mess of the revolution. Yeah, as Mao says, the revolution fails because of the vanguard, not the masses of people. And that's why even the question of the leader is so important. It's vital that in our struggle, the vanguard party finds a leader that loves the people unquestionably, is able to influence them, and is able to draw them into enthusiasm. This is vital. Right? And the failure to recognize that will always, 100% of the time, make a mess of the revolution. And I think, and that's one thing why I do find, at the end of the day, I do find the position that DPRK takes towards their leaders to be very inspiring. A very non-apologetic, the masses are in control of society. This is the way they express their trust in the leadership. This is the way they rally around the party, by rallying around the leader as the core of that party. We support that. We encourage that. Kim Jong-un, for example, just as an example of this, Kim Jong-un has always said he doesn't want his picture hung next to Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung. But when they decide that that's what they do anyway at this new revolutionary school, Kim Jong-un can say as much as he wants, right? But at the end of the day, it's the masses, the people who decide this stuff. And so his picture is hung up at the new revolutionary school right next to Kim Jong-il. Much to Comrade Kim Jong-un's horror. Stalin tried to step down 4 times, right? The thing that I find inspiring is how DPRK, instead of, like, you look at what Khrushchev did, right? Hey, East Germany, welcome in. You look at what Khrushchev did, right? Khrushchev, he denounced the former leadership. He attacked Stalin, which by extension attacked Lenin's work as well. And we saw the results of this. I'm not saying that's the only factor, but that is an important factor that led to the overthrow of USSR. Absolutely. Not to say that there was no mistakes during Lenin and Stalin's time. There were. But you see, what was making up for those mistakes was that the masses of people were closely, voluntarily following the policies that they were putting forward because they found them hugely inspiring people. Lenin and Stalin, that is, right? After that, you had a problem of the party having extreme difficulties getting their policies to be passed. And so they became more and more steeped in bureaucracy rather than developing, like, mass theory. So yeah, that's why I find DPRK, the way they champion their leaders, I find that inspiring. Because, again, they basically said, this is the way the masses treat their leaders. We do not question that. The masses are the masters of society. And so what you see the results of that. And I don't think that's anything to denounce or fight. Like, I see some socialists who are like, oh, but don't you think it's a little weird? It's like, it's only weird because your program, it's only weird because the people that you see in your society as, or you're taught are heroes, are actually fucking horrible people. And it doesn't take much digging to realize that they're horrible people. So yeah, of course you find that weird. You've grown up your whole lives with what you were taught as heroes and leaders as being these fucking horrible individuals, like FDR, the fascist, for example. All right, Mama, thank you for hanging out. The latest round of capitalism reform, the latest redirection of its energy, was its highest and last form. The struggles of the 30s and 40s and 50s completed the totalitarianization of the country and perfected the system of total mass social deception. I've had learned men tell me that controlled capitalism, monopoly capital, fascism, corporativism, or whatever your vernacular, is a form of welfare statism. This is precisely what we were intended to believe. That the political takeover by monopoly capital was actually an advance in the welfare of the common people. Even the old left promotes the lie that valid concessions have been made by the ruling class, as if deceptively better working conditions and illusory wages increases were Marxism. By the way, this again, I know I keep mentioning it, but again, this again is why Midwestern Marx makes the erroneous belief that we've had 3 revolutions in the past, because they fall for this right here, the valid concessions lie. A true Marxist revolution abolishes the wage system. The true welfare state would be the final and highest stage of social development, where where the world and the state are one, where the material and psychological needs of the masses have been met and political regimes have ceased to exist. The New Deal and the resulting military-industrial complex is welfare statism. I swear I'll strangle the next idiot who repeats that line. All ingredients for a fascist state were already present. Racism, the morbid traditional fear of blacks, Indians, Mexicans, the desire to inflict pain on them when they began to compete in industrial sectors, the resentment and the seedbed of fear is patterned into every modern capitalist society. It grows out of a sense of insecurity and insignificance that is inculcated into the workers by the conditions of life and work under capitalism. This sense of vulnerability is the breeding ground of racism. At the same time, the ruling class actively promotes racism against the blacks of the lower classes. This programmed racism has always served to distract the huge numbers of people who subsist at just a slightly higher level than those in a more debased condition. In the 1870s, the strikes frequently ended in anti-Chinese or anti-black lynchings. It conforms to dual requirements of the authoritarian personality, conformity accompanied by compulsive sadism. Racism has served always in the US as a pressure release for the psychopathic destructiveness evinced on a people, made fearful by and insecure by the way of life they never understood, and resented from the day of their birth. In the US, World War II was the principal cause of the total breakdown of the working class movement and its revolutionary consciousness, which had been built up by the crisis years of the 30s and all that went before them. Lesser attempts at suppression had been made prior to the war through the typical reformist policies of modern fascist regimes. The economy had been closed, banks regulated, deficit spending had been practiced on projects like TVA and CCC, the arms race that eventually culminated in the fascist military-industrial complex-based economy broke the closed economic deal. Two conditions distinguished the successful establishment of fascism in this country. The old vanguard parties cropped out and supported a nation-state ruling class war, which wasted the blood and energy of their proletariats. At the time, resistance to the war would have seemed like simple common sense. If Stalin gave the order to support the US war effort, he was a fool. In any case, the old vanguard's support should have been for the people's struggle inside the US. With a little more patience and sacrifice, Stalin could have eventually marched to the Atlantic. With all of Europe in ruins and German economy already in its final stages of disintegration with the US presence in Europe, capitalism could be dead today. Instead, US imperialism rose to behemoth proportions. After the war, international markets opened in Europe, Africa, and Asia, with the flea market of radios, TVs, and novelties here at its center. For the sake of those trinkets and baubles, the labor elites diffused the righteous demand of the people. Consensus politics formed as a result of their defection simply solidified the totalitarian regime with all the opinion molding facilities under the ruling class. Elections and political parties have no significance when all serious contenders for public office are fascist, and the electorate is thoroughly misled about the true nature of the candidates. One cannot say all the people who vote are unaware, just as one cannot say the 1,200 professors who backed Mussolini were all frightened. Those who are aware and still do nothing constructive are among the most pathetic victims of totalitarian process. The necessary shock troops and tools for creating the false contrapositive psychosocial basis of a fascist-type pseudo-society were in short supply in this country prior and during the process of the fascist takeover. There was little of this consciousness among the middle classes. So the first terror came from the specifically formed and hired goons of the DuPonts and Rockefellers, the Black Legion, the Guardians of the Republic, the FBI. They destroyed the already disintegrating vanguard, leaving the degenerate elements of the working class as the only available mass. Class relations were slowly altered as a result of this action by the co-opted labor sectors. Government agents were sent to infiltrate scattered labor movements. The disguise was complete. The satisfaction of labor's short-term economic interests was made possible by the giant consumers market and the military complex. Ties were formed between rulers and labor leaders. The elites of the proletarian movement were compromised. A ruling class and its governing elites were centralized and were carefully co-optive. A fascist arrangement, death and prison for all who object. Fascism in its final and secure state. It has happened here. And the only recourse is an appeal to arms. The corporative state allows for no genuine free political opposition. They only allow for meaningless gatherings, where they can plant more spies than participants. They feel secure in their ability to mold the opinion of a people interested only in wages. However, real revolutionary activity will draw panic-stricken gunfire or heart attacks. So what is to be done after a revolution has failed? After our enemies have created a conservative mass society based on meaningless electoral politics, spectator sports, and a 3% annual rise in purchasing power strictly regulated to negate itself with a corresponding rise in the cost of living. What is to be done about the expertly, scientifically calculated, contrapositive mobilization of the entire society? What can we do with a people who have gone through the authoritarian process and come out sick to the core? There will be a fight. The fight will take place in the central cities. It will be spearheaded by the blacks of the lower class and their vanguard party, the Black Panther Party. Real union activity will eliminate the corporative ties between the regime ruling class and labor. People at the top will be removed, and the guy with the programmed mind will have no union boss to think for him. He will remain neutral or join us in our fight to liberate him. We will work this attack at the productive level, indirectly, by first building our central city communes, which will revolutionize the all-too conservative black laborer. We will build these communes against all resistance, the pamphlet in one hand, the gun in the other. In blacks, authoritarian traits are mainly the effects of terrorism and a lack of intellectual stimulation. They have been chosen the less dangerous and complicated mode of existence: survival. All classes, all people are subject to authoritarian syndrome. It requires only the proper set of eco-sociological circumstantial pressure to turn blacks around and reawaken their revolutionary consciousness. We're hungry. Our overall task is to separate the people from the hatred state. They must be made to realize that the interests of the state and the ruling class are one and the same. They must be taught to realize that the present political regime exists only to balance the productive forces within the society in favor of the ruling class. It is at the ruling class and the governing elites, including those of labor, that we must aim our bolts. The average working man will simply withdraw or watch with secret satisfaction, or actively join in when we bring his union boss under attack. We blacks have lived with terrorism for generations. It no longer affects us. It will intensify. We must prepare a counter-terrorism. A man can never be so repressed that he cannot strike back in some way, but it must begin now. The Rand Corporation does 80% of its work for the military-industrial intelligence complex. 750 or more colleges offer police science courses. 247 additional colleges offer associate degrees in law enforcement. 44 offer bachelor degrees. The National Guard numbers 390,000. The CIAD, Counterintelligence Analyst Detachment, the 113th Military Intelligence Group, is designed for the surveillance of private citizens. The police state isn't coming. It's here, glaring and threatening. How do we raise a new revolutionary consciousness against a system program against our old methods? Revolution is against the law. It will not be allowed, not in significant form. That makes the true revolutionary an outlaw, and the black revolutionary a doomed man. As blacks, we must function as the vanguard in any hostilities. We must use a new approach, unite and revolutionize the Black Central City Commune, and slowly provide the people with the incentive to fight by allowing them to create programs that will meet all of their social, political, and economic needs. We must fill the vacuums left by the establishment order. We must push the settlers off our land when they won't cooperate with the new communal life of our system. We must learn from the people. We must learn from the workers, the discipline they are so highly skilled in. In return, we must teach them the benefits of our revolutionary ideals. We must move blacks to the forefront of our really productive assault on the outside enemy reactionary culture. Not only on the productive level, but in all significant areas of property relations. We must promote and support enforced rent strikes. Merchants must come over to our side or face the appropriation of their property for the commune. We must build a subsistence economy and a socio-political infrastructure so that we can become an example for all revolutionary people. Fascism has established itself in a most disguised and efficient manner in this country. It feels so secure that the leaders allow us the luxury of faint protest. Take protests too far, however, and they will show their other face. Doors will be kicked down in the night, and machine gun fire and buckshot will become the medium of exchange. I am an extremist, a communist. Not communistic, a communist. And I must be destroyed, or I will join my comrades in the only communist party in this country, the Black Panther Party. I will give them my all, every dirty fighting trick in the annals of war. Nothing will defeat our revenge, and nothing will countervail our march to victory. We come to our conclusion. The only historical recourse that is left is to us. Freedom means warmth and protection against harsh exposure to the elements. It means food, not garbage. It means truth, harmony, and the social relations that spring from these. It means the best medical attention whenever it's needed. It means employment that is reasonable, that coincides with the individual necessities and feelings. We will have this freedom, even at the cost of total war. Wow, Dave Legend. Thank you so much for the raid, comrade. We just finished a fantastic read. Welcome in, raiders. Welcome, welcome. Oh, we just finished a really good read. Don't worry. Hold on, let me stretch. Ah! Don't worry, because it will be on my YouTube.